Thank you, Dave. It's a great pleasure to introduce Janet. I know Janet from the 1745 Association, and a few years ago, Janet was the co-organiser of a gathering that we had in the northwest of England. We're based in Shap, and we visited Carlisle and Kendal. Janet's got a wealth of experience, had lots of careers: teacher, pony trek escort, candle maker, timeshare receptionist, shop assistant, bus driver, home carer, tour guide, and presenter of talks. And Janet sent me a huge list of the various talks that she can do, but one of the entertaining things that I remember on the bus and the Sharp excursion was her experience of pack horses. So I suggested that tonight she tell us about pack horse days and pack horse ways. So over to Janet.
Thank you very much, Bob. Gosh, can everybody hear me? If you want to sort of put a thumbs up, I'm hoping that I'm coming over loud and clear. Obviously, this is quite a departure for all of us. I would normally be standing physically in front of you with a 5-foot screen. I would have slides and I'd be talking for an hour. Instead, I've got handheld pictures. I've got half an hour. But I'll do my best to pick out some of the points concerning the historical narrative of the days of pack horses. I would just say that I feel I have a little bit of an experience as far as journeys with pack animals are concerned. I don't know if you can see the large picture at the back there, but I'm standing with a pony on the top of England's highest mountain. I did several journeys, in fact, in the 1980s with pack animals, partly for research purposes. And I don't know if you can see this little chap and I, but this pony and I, you can see it's reflecting badly off the screen, but this pony and I walked 1,000 miles in 1991 to London, again through Wales. So part of this whole subject that we've largely forgotten about, of course, was to actually go out there and do some journeys. But I'm not going to talk about my journeys as such tonight. I want to pick up on various aspects of the days when 4 hooves, not 4 wheels, ruled the road. And I'm going to start with a little rhyme, and some of you may have heard it. It's concerning these things. And of course, these things, bell horses, there's a little rhyme that goes, bell horses, what time of day? 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 and away. Bell horses, what time of day? 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 6 and away. And so the rhyme goes on. That picture you've just seen was a journey I did with some school children back in the 1980s. My local junior school, the headmaster and I, the top juniors of which, we set off on a journey for a week around the Lake District. You can ask me more about that later if you want. I'm amazed I'm still here. Exhausting but great fun. But yes, so bell horses, because apparently pack animals carried bells. You've got a horn in your car. I like to think it's a little bit like that. It was perhaps a warning to other road users, get out of the way, here I come, or indeed advising yourself. Come to that shortly. But you know, if you had something to sell, having the bell ringing as you arrive at the village might be quite a good idea. But we'll probably come back to bells in a little while. As I say, this whole way of life we've forgotten about, because today we have motorized transport. We jump in our car to go from A to B. We have lorries and trains and planes and goodness knows what to transport our goods. But take all that away Now, I know in Scotland, perhaps in some places this is a little bit different, because certainly in the Highland area and over in the western side, you were probably more used to travelling on water than over the mountains. But certainly in England, and particularly in the north of England, pack animals were the order of the day for many centuries, partly due to the rather lumpy, bumpy landscape that we've got in the north of England. You see, one thing I can tell you, and I hope this picture illustrates it, this chap standing with me on the top of Scafell Pike, England's highest mountain, is that a horse can carry a load where it cannot pull a load. That's quite important if we think about what roads were like back in the days. Well, let's go back to the medieval period and even possibly before. You know, after the Romans left, and they did leave us, certainly in England, with a reasonable road network. But really, those roads didn't get touched for many centuries afterwards. And during the medieval period, in some areas, road transport by wheels, you know, horses and carts, was incredibly difficult. And if you add to that the lumpy, bumpy landscape of the north of England, it's not surprising that we have pack animals carrying goods up and over, you know, from one valley to the next, over ground that you really wouldn't expect an animal to travel over. I was told, you see, that the pony would not get to the top of Scafell Pike on that journey in 1987, but I hope you can just about make out there that, well, he did do it, and more besides. So yes, trying to pull a load, particularly if the ground is wet and the wheels are getting bogged down, a horse with a load on its back is more likely to get through. In your part of the world, in some areas, certainly you've got precipitous landscape, haven't you? I'm thinking of the Highlands again. You've also got some lovely peat bogs, and neither of those are particularly conducive for travelling overland. But you, where possible, you certainly made use of your water. I'm thinking of the sea now in particular. But let's go back to the pack animals. The humans probably domesticated the horse along with several other sorts of animals back in the prehistoric period, in the Bronze Age. And I'm sure from even those early times, we were putting things as well as people on the backs of those animals. But perhaps if we could just come forward to the medieval period, because that seems to have been maybe the start of pack animals being used in any numbers. And they were carrying predominantly, well, this stuff actually, the stuff you can perhaps just see underneath my pack saddle here. This is a sheepskin. We're talking about wool, aren't we? Which certainly put England, I have to be careful, don't I, here? But certainly put England on the map. I don't know if you're, no, I better not mention Scottish wools. Let's stick to England. England and Wales, anyway. Certainly in the medieval period, many people were making a good living from the sale of their wool clip. But of course, if you are living in a remote and difficult landscape and halfway up a hillside, you're probably not going to be using wheels to move your wool clip. It's much more likely that you're going to put your wool on the back of a pack horse. See if we can find a couple of little illustrations. In fact, yes, there's a famous one from Yorkshire here. This illustration is shown a lot by a man called George Walker. Now then, if you see, hopefully you can see that, just about make out that there are a couple of animals here and they've got strange things on their back. Those are wool sacks. Yorkshire and the Lake District are famous for their wool towns and their wool sales and wool cloth halls and so on and so forth. You know, even our poorest wools were finding a market out in Europe. and even as far as Italy in the medieval period. So the moving of this wool, where it couldn't be done by carts, was being done by pack animals. I can give you a real example of that. Believe it or not, there are brokerage accounts that survive in Southampton, that's all the way down in the south of England, that tell us who was arriving with their pack animals between the 1490s and the 1530s. And we know that people travelling from what we now call Cumbria, the Lake District, with their pack animals laden with wool, were arriving in Southampton all year round pretty much. They weren't just going down there in the summer. We know they were arriving in January, February. The mind boggles. They were giving their name, they were giving what they were carrying, and we even know what they were leaving with. Because if you're going to do such a long journey all the way from the north of England with your wool, you're probably going to, for economic reasons, want to come back with something else, just like the modern lorries do today, I'm sure. And we know that ponies coming back up north were carrying imported goods, luxury goods, sometimes the spices, the dried fruits and things like that. But canvas and alum are also mentioned. That's just one little snapshot, a little detail, and there must be other documents dotted around somewhere, and I'd love to find out more. But so there we are. Wool, in some cases, was being moved by packhorse, and indeed on very long journeys. What about those tracks and trails? In the north of England, in some places, and particularly the Lake District, we've got a nice hard ground up on those mountain tops. But down in the valleys, it's a different matter. And tracks eventually are going to get worn into what are called hollow ways. And they're rather also prone to having water flowing down them once you get a hollow in the ground like that. So in some places, again, this seems to be peculiar to the north of England, something called causes or causeways were being built. Now, I don't know if first of all, I'll show you a little black and white picture of a horse causey. Can you see the pack horse there with the man walking? And if you look very carefully, you'll see it seems to be walking on a path made of enormous great slabs of rock, and they're perhaps exaggerated on that picture, but if I can show you this colour illustration of this causey, you might just about be able to see this, because these you find in the north of England, in Yorkshire in particular, in all areas of Yorkshire, out on the North York moors. It's a single line of stones. A causey, it's from the French word causey, that's the C-A-U-C-I, which means a trod or a raised trackway. And this was a way by which, if you're going to put down this line of stones, it means that no matter how awful the weather, how wet the ground on either side, you and your pack horse load are going to get through. And that's important, isn't it, if you are selling things or going to the market, transporting goods and so on. Now, obviously, these tracks are not everywhere, but there are still a number of them, amazingly, still surviving today. And more of them are being found, particularly after a moorland fire, for instance, when the heather is being burnt back, and lo and behold, these little causes are popping up. In the Lake District, we tend to have more cobbled or metalled surfaces rather than these single slabs of stone. So it was one way of ensuring that even in the winter, and even if the ground was really wet, you and your pack load were going to get through. Horse causey, just bear with me a moment. Now, I've mentioned wool. I should also mention salt, which was such an important commodity. Everybody needs salt to survive, and certainly salt was being moved in the medieval period. I haven't really studied the movement of salt very much, but I know that in my part of the world here in Yorkshire, South Yorkshire and West Yorkshire, we have a number of tracks with the word salt in that name, like Salter's Way, Salter Gate, Salter's Trod. The salt from places like Cheshire seems to have been heading this way, and no doubt across into many areas. But you know, those pack ponies weren't just carrying wool and salt, they were carrying all sorts of things, including this. Now, again, you can maybe just make out this card I'm holding up, which is a coastal scene. There's a ship look on the sands. You probably can't see, there's a pack horse there with his white rump towards you, but basically this animal has got his panniers on, the ship is being unloaded, fish is going into those baskets, and those ponies are going to deliver the fish. And in some cases, it's going to travel a long way. Now, you might not believe me if I say, for instance, that fish from the Solway, which is right up in the north of England, cutting to Scotland, was arriving at the fish market in Billingsgate in London, where it was fetching a very good price. And you're saying, don't be silly, Janet, that couldn't possibly be. Well, if you won't believe me, will you believe Daniel Defoe? Because in 1724, he told us in his writings how they did it. And he's talking about, it's salmon, by the way, in this case, that's being taken from the Solway area. Carry salmon, fresh as they take them, up to London upon horses, which, changing often, go night and day without intermission. And as they say, out goes the post, for that the fish comes very sweet and good to London, where the extraordinary price they yield, from 2 shillings and sixpence to 4 shillings a pound, pays very well for their carriage. Goodness me. So, you know, America didn't invent the Pony Express. We obviously had our own version up here, because he's saying changing horses often, going night and day. I think that fish could have got down to London in less than 3 days by that method. And if that's so, it's better than the Royal Mail today, isn't it? I'm also coming across references to fish being moved on journeys from the coast of Yorkshire, you know, coming across the moors and down to York and other cities here in Yorkshire. So there seems to have been quite a movement of fish, and it's not all going on wheeled transport. It's sometimes going by Packhorse. Amazing. But other things were, if you just about think of any commodity that you might need moving, all sorts of foodstuffs were being moved on Packhorses sometimes, but also heavy goods like stone, coal, lime, iron ore, lead ore, and things like that. The mind boggles. And also liquids, ladies and gentlemen. Now, here's a scene from London in the 1600s. Can you see this rather sour-looking mule? Perhaps just notice he's got barrels on his back. This is the vinegar cellar, for goodness sake. So it's not going around in a cart, look. This one is being moved by mule. So vinegar's being moved by mule, and I love this illustration. This illustration is a photocopy, so you're not seeing it in its best light, but this is from a wonderful illuminated manuscript of 1340, the Lutteral Psalter. If you ever get a chance to see the illustrations from this book, do have a look. But this is the water carrier. So we've got a pack animal. He's got a big leather bag slung over his back. He's got a little pot up on the top with the measuring spoons in, and he's being driven along by a very miserable looking man. Water in the medieval times, oh gosh, you really wouldn't want to drink the water, would you, if you lived in a town or a city? But maybe if somebody was bringing you spring water from the countryside, you might have just risked it. But apparently that is the water carrier. Oh, and something on a more serious level that was being carried and moved around by pack horses. And I don't know if you can see, this says the war horses. I'm sorry, we've got horrible light resting on this, but thousands, hundreds of thousands of horses were sent, weren't they? Particularly during the First World War. I don't know whether any of that's showing up. I'm having trouble seeing. But, you know, in those dreadful conditions over in Europe, think of the mud and the mire that we see in many, many photographs. And again, you know, carts are getting bogged down, and yet they're loading their ammunition and gun parts onto the backs of horses and leading them through the worst of this mess. And many, many animals, of course, lost their lives, didn't they, during that time? It was all pretty horrendous. So, yes, and for sure, we've been using horses to move our weapons and ourselves during war ever since we had wars, I guess. Ever since we've been fighting. Well, who was working with these pack horses? Seems to have, a bit like the lorry operators today, we seem to have both ends of the scale. You perhaps have heard of Eddie Stobart. You might have seen his wagons on the road. And that's a big company, isn't it, with fleets of lorries. And there certainly were people who owned many pack horses, maybe 100 or more. I'm not saying 100 ponies went out in one line. 20 to 30 ponies was not unusual to go out in a string, depending on what they were carrying. So you've sort of got your big time operators, and you're going to need a lot of animals, of course, if you're moving the heavy things. But then you've got your badgers, or in Scotland, they were called cadgers. A badger was an itinerant hawker. Forget the black and white animal. And badgers seem to have had maybe one pack horse, sometimes two. This might not have been your full-time job. You might have been working on the land for part of the time, but you'd be taking goods to market, usually one type of goods. So you might be a cheese badger or an oats, grain badger or whatever. You would quite often have a fixed circuit where you were going from market to market town. But these badgers seem to have had a bit of bad press. I mean, the word badger, if you badger somebody, you pester them, don't you? I can imagine the badgers saying, "Oh, come on, missus, buy my goods." Well, whatever the case, by the middle of the 1500s, the government, it would seem, was so bothered about the perhaps illegal activities of badgers that they drew up a whole lot of rules for these badgers. And not just the badgers, cattle drivers as well came under new restrictions. And so you had to have a license. You had to have somebody standing surety for you. You had to be a householder and so on and so forth. And all this great long list of new rules, a bit like Boris with his new rules. And, at the end of this statute, it said, northern badgers are exempt from these rules. So one wonders what was happening up here, because I can well imagine that there would have been some badgers, and we know from court documents that some badgers were mixing, for instance, sawdust with their flour to sell, or giving, selling underweight or selling outside the recognised markets. So there was, I'm not saying all badgers were bad, but it would seem they got themselves a bit of a reputation. Now, in case you're thinking this was a man's world, ladies, if you can see this little postcard, it's from the area that we used to call Yugoslavia. And you can see some two-pack donkeys, I hope. But honestly, although she looks very frightening, that is a woman. And we know, again, from records, and some work has been done here in Derbyshire, in northern England. So we know that there were women badgers, and whether they had lost their husband who had been a badger and they were carrying on the trade, or whether they were doing it in their own right, isn't always clear. But there was a minority of female badgers then operating in this country. Gosh, in a very much a man's world and a very physically demanding world of walking with ponies and loading and unloading, one wonders about these women. They must have been a tough sort, mustn't they? What about types of, what breeds of animals? What were we using? Our native breeds are wonderful, and you've got, in fact, I'll show you this now, although it comes up really in a minute with when we talk about saddles, but this is a postcard depicting, it says Highland ponies, and I know your Highland ponies, they're absolutely brilliant. Very, very strong, hardy and sure-footed, just like the animal here that I took to the top of Scafell Pike, which was a Dales pony, a Yorkshire breed, and just like the little chap that I took on that 1,000-mile walk, which I hope I mentioned at the beginning, this pony was a fell pony, so he's a Lakeland pony. So why not use our native breeds? They were as tough as old boots. You don't want something too big and rangy for loading and unloading. You also want something relatively quiet and that can hold its weight. So it would seem that, you know, our local breeds seem to have been used, particularly in the north of England, the Dales and the fell ponies. Saddles, I've got to rattle through because I know I'm on a time limit. Saddles, now, yes, I've just shown you the Scottish picture. There's some ladies here from Holy, well, I say ladies, they look equally frightening, but there we are, Holy Island ladies, 1800s, with their little donkeys. Don't know where you can't really see their saddles, but you can certainly see that they've got sort of open panniers there. They're collecting seaweed off the shore. I've got some Spanish examples of, oh, this isn't going to show up too well, is it? No, I'll leave that. It's reflecting badly tonight. But pack saddles came in a variety of shapes. Now, don't know whether you can see my saddle here, but I do have an illustration of this same saddle here. Now, can you see? I hope you can. It's literally 6 pieces of wood, 2 cross pieces, bolted onto 2 side panels. I hope you can all see that. And that same saddle, here it is. This is the saddle that travelled 1,000 miles with me, and it was absolutely brilliant. And it's just one type of pack saddle that has been around, that style has been around for hundreds of years. Probably you would have seen it in medieval times, and actually, if you go to the Mediterranean today, you will still see that sort of saddle being used on donkeys and mules and ponies. And it works exceptionally well, and mine certainly did. I had mine made for me out of Lakeland oak just before I set off on that journey, and it worked a treat. And onto that saddle, you're obviously then going to attach your various baskets, panniers, crates, boxes. It really depends on what these ponies are carrying as to how the goods are being moved. If it's wallets, that big saddle right across, the pack right across the back of the animal. So yes, that's my marvellous pack saddle with the strapping is a bit of car seatbelt strapping here and attached to a girth, and that was all it needed. There was no extra harness for my pack saddle. Now, in reality, if my pony had been carrying a lot of weight, he would have needed strap at the front and back, breeching and you know, the front here, because if you're going up steep slopes or down steep slopes, that saddle is going to shift if your pony's carrying anything like a decent amount of weight. 200 to 300 weight. I'm not metric, I'm sorry, hence no PowerPoint. I'm not in the modern world. So yes, those ponies were sometimes carrying quite an amount. So extra strap, extra harness needed. Definitely. So those were the saddles. Problems that you might have if you were doing these journeys. Well, of course, your underfoot conditions, those tracks and trods, some of them may well have been in bad repair, and certain times of the year, these journeys must have been horrendous. And we know that it wasn't just travellers on foot that were losing their lives in bad weather. We know that sometimes whole trains of pack horses disappeared on the moors in snowdrifts and so on and so forth. So at certain times of the year, it must have been quite a risky business. In periods of wet weather, and if you are going down a valley, you're probably going to need something like this to take you safely over the water. You're going to need some sort of a bridge, aren't you? Packhorse bridges, well, there's a lot written about the bridges. Don't know whether I've got anything like a halfway decent picture. They're out in the, these are probably not going to show up. This is not a good picture anyway, but there's a much bigger bridge here. But I'm thinking in particular the classic little Packhorse bridges, which are a single stone arch, often over a stream or a burn, out in the middle of nowhere. And interestingly, the period when most of those bridges were being built, those little single span arches, is between 1650 and 1750. Is that a clue to the height of the days of the Packhorse? It could be, couldn't it? Before those stone bridges, many of the small bridges were wooden, but of course they're going to get washed away if there's a flood. So many of them, as I say, were rebuilt in stone. Whereas obviously in the towns and cities, you've got your stone bridges from very early periods indeed. What about route finding? Finding your way, especially if you've never been that way before, goodness me. Well, again, out on these moors, you sometimes see, again, I don't know how clear this is going to be, but you see stones, that one's leaning at a rakish angle, finger posts, milestones, goodness me, out in featureless landscapes where the path isn't always clear, those sort of things would have been very useful indeed. So that will have all helped to make your journey a little bit safer, as long as perhaps you could understand which way you should have been going in the first place. And for those on those long journeys, of course, you would need overnight accommodation. And that's where the inns were so important. And some inns, even in modernity, still bear names like the Packhorse Inn, or the Wool Pack, or the Woolsack, or even String of Horses, referring to string or a line of pack horses. Other inns that we know had those names have sadly either disappeared, or they've decided that those names are a bit old-fashioned and they've changed their names. So research into sort of that side of things, it can be a bit tricky. And there's a whole range of other industries that are going to support the people who are traveling with pack horses, because they're going to need food, they're going to need, the ponies are going to need shoeing, so blacksmiths are going to be important, saddlers for making the pack saddles and the harness, and of course those all-important bells. You know, it only occurred to me recently when the ice cream van came onto where I live, onto our estate about 6 months ago, because as soon as I heard the sound, of course, and it was a nice day, I thought, yeah, I'll go and get an ice cream. So grabbed my purse and out I went. How would I have known that he was there if he hadn't played his music? And I just think that that could be one of the reasons why you might want to have the bell ringing as you went through a village or a small town, to advertise yourself indeed. But also out on those moors, if you're traveling with a whole line of ponies, particularly if you're traveling at night, if you can hear the bells ringing, at least you've got more idea of where your ponies are. And as I said near the beginning, get out of the way, here I come, because if you're coming into a town down a narrow alleyway with your laden ponies in one direction and somebody else is trying to come the other way, somebody's got to give way, haven't they? But you'll notice my bell has got a red ribbon on it. And indeed, when I did my journeys with my ponies in the past, although I haven't got it on here, but I had a sprig of rowan or mountain ash in my hat. I had a hold stone around my neck, and I had red ribbons on the bells and on my stick. And all of those things were believed by people in the past to make sure you had a safe journey. You know, these long travels were dangerous, and people were quite superstitious. People believed in nasty things, spirits and witches and so on that could get you en route. So it was perhaps quite a good idea to protect yourself. So I certainly did anyway, and I did come back from my journeys. Now, of course, my journeys were done in modernity, and although I was on my own, obviously I had, you know, sort of modern backup in a sense. But I'd like to show you a rare photograph of a real Packhorse woman. Well, you're seeing her in her dotage here. She was probably the last of her kind. This is Mary Alice Hartley, or Ailsa O'Fussers as she was known, who operated in the Rochdale, Clitheroe, Blackburn area in her time, just as her father before her. By the time this picture was taken, she's just got her one donkey, Jerry, but in her heyday, she operated with a string of ponies carrying lime and coal. It is said that Ailsa died in around about 1870, and the article I was reading even told me where she was buried, and I went to the churchyard hoping I might find her grave. I'd like to pay my respects from a modern, you know, Packhorse woman to somebody who did it for real, but I didn't find her grave. It's not surprising, because the likes of Ailsa wouldn't have been able to afford a headstone, you know, with writing on it. But I feel sure she is buried somewhere in an unmarked grave in the churchyard at Whitworth, if anybody's interested. So in modernity, have we all forgotten about pack horses? We don't have them anymore in Britain, do we? Well, no, we don't in Britain, but you know, in many countries around the world, pack animals are still going great guns. I don't know if you can see this little pony. He's in China, look. He's carrying bricks. Can you look at the track carefully? Because he's walking on something that looks amazingly like a little trod, a little causey that I mentioned earlier. And of course, in many, many countries, particularly in the poorer countries and in the Mediterranean area, I don't know if you can see this donkey well laden up here, but you know, many, many poor people are reliant on their working animals to keep them fed. You can see this bottom picture here. These are mules carrying sand. I think it could be India or Pakistan. What you probably can't see is that they've got bells on. If I come very close, you might just see they've got bells around their neck, amazingly. I support, so there are pack animals still working in many countries today, and there is a charity called the Brook here who have been instrumental really in making the lives of these working equines a lot better. All down to a lady called Dorothy Brooke, who at the end of the First World War, a well-to-do lady, was on holiday in Egypt and was horrified to discover that some of our war horses didn't come home, ladies and gentlemen. They were sold off to work in the streets of Pakistan and Egypt in the most horrendous conditions. And Dorothy Brooke was so horrified, given that those horses had, you know, given their all for us, that she did something about it. And ultimately, the charity that she started is still going strong today. And she rescued, by the way, over 3,000 of those war horses, and I think arranged for them to come back home. So in this country, no, you're unlikely to see pack animals, but you know, take a walk up a hillside. You might be following a track that zigzags from side to side. That almost certainly is an old Packhorse route, or a holloway. You might see a stone drinking trough at the side of the road. Yes, lots of other people would be using those troughs, like the drovers and peddlers and travellers. But those packs need to have water too. Place names, Badgergate, Badgerway, Salterway, and all the rest of it, and lots of other strange names associated with this whole industry still survive. And take yourself off into many a museum in the north of England, and you will see Packhorse bells on collars in a number of those, and even the odd pub name might give you a little clue. But I'm going to end, I'll end with two things actually. I've just suddenly remembered, and I did mention it to Bob. A few years ago, I was given parts of a donkey pack saddle. I just have to mention this because it's so unusual. And here are two of those pieces, look, that notched together. This saddle has come from the United Arab Emirates and was found many years ago under a sand dune. Now, if I there we go. Can you see why I'm saying it's unusual? Can you see that the wood has been decorated? Can you see those punched decorations on this pack saddle? So I've got these 4 pieces, and they're beautifully decorated. I've never ever heard or seen a pack saddle that was decorated, but I'm lucky enough to have been given these 4 pieces, and I hold them and think, if only this wood could talk. You know, who decorated that saddle? Did that person think so much of his animal, or was he just doodling? We'll never know, will we? But that is so unusual. I think these few words, which some of you may recognise because it's called the Tribute to the Horse, and it's often read out at the Horse of the Year show, these words are very apt, and I certainly read these words out to my fine friend here, this pony William Wordsworth, who came with me to the top of Scarfell Pike. Well, he did more than that. He walked 400 miles around the Lake District with me in the most terrible weather in 1987. And the day we got to the top of the pike, it was one little gap in an otherwise terrible month where we broke rainfall records. But on this day, at the top of that mountain, I read this. Where in this wide world can man find nobility without pride, friendship without envy, or beauty without vanity? Here, where grace is laced with muscle, and strength by gentleness confined, he serves without civility, he has fought without enmity. There is nothing so powerful, nothing less violent. Sorry, I get choked up. There is nothing so quick, nothing more patient. England's past has been born on his back. All our history is his industry. We are his heirs, he our inheritance. Ladies and gentlemen, that is the horse, isn't it? I've galloped you through a number of topics as best I can in these very difficult circumstances. If anybody's got any questions, I'd be delighted to try and answer them. And I do apologise that a lot of what I was talking about, and indeed images that I was showing you, were very much south of the border. So yes, there we go. A little bit about days when 4 hooves ruled the road.
Thanks very much, Janet. See the hands are up already. Ronnie?
Thanks very much, President Dave. Thank you very much, Janet, for a very interesting talk that's really evoked some memories to me. And of course, Packhorses up this part of the world are becoming things, you know, in maybe the last couple of 100 years. We had Kirriemuir used to be a linen spinning town before it became a town, and Packhorses conveyed the spun linen from Kirriemuir through Lumley Den, which people here will know what I'm talking about, into Dundee, and that was a regular route.
Oh, wonderful!
All right, and the other thing, of course, that's to the south of Kirriemuir. To the north, we've got the Angus Glens, it's really the Highlands, if you wish, and of course, that's where a lot of whisky, both legal and illegal, was distilled, and of course that was conveyed around by Packhorses. You mentioned the causeway. In Forfar, there's a little street called Little Causeway, and that probably derives from that because it was made up of cobbles, and just exactly what you said. And in Scotland, we often call cobbles cassies, which is like you said. I do remember a cadger when I was a wee boy. There used to be a lad used to come along from Ailith with his horse and cart selling stuff, and his name was John Begg, and he was nicknamed Cadger Begg. He was an original cadger. Other couple of things you might find interesting. Everybody here knows I spent my life in the army, and I was out in Hong Kong in the 70s, and all our supplies, water, food and everything was brought up when we were up in the mountainous area of Hong Kong by mule, by pack mule.
Yes.
And it was the last pack mule company in the British Army. And also, and you mentioned the Great War, First World War, about the Western Front, but what you maybe don't know, and I've got a good picture, but I can't show it up to you, but you can maybe pass it on. And in what they call the Salonika Front, which is out in Greece, again, up in the mountains, the only way they could get casualties, wounded soldiers, back to the first aid posts was by mule. And the panniers strapped to the sides of the mules. And if the men could sit, they sat in these panniers, if not, they were sort of like on a stretcher. So you evoked quite a few memories to me, and thank you very much for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Roland. And of course, actually in Scotland, in modernity, on some of your large estates, your lovely Highland ponies or garrons are being used, are they not, to bring the stags down that have been shot off the hill?
And Malcolm Taylor, I'm sure, who would be able to tell you a wee bit more than that. But you're absolutely right. And when the Royal Guard performs up at Ballater at Braemar, you know, when the royal family are there, they actually have a group of soldiers who are actually trained to take load the stags or the deer onto ponies, and then trained to take them back down. Still on the go. There you go.
Thanks, Ronnie. Philip had his hand up.
Yes. You mentioned the donkey saddle, and Ronnie mentioned the mules. I wondered, you often basically talked about them being horses, and I just wondered how often it was donkeys and mules that were used, and whether they were seen as being too stubborn, and whether the horses were more compliant.
Yes, when I'm using the term horse, I really, I suppose, technically should be saying pony, because horses are a bit big. But interesting that you should bring that up, because in many of the early illustrations of pack animals, i.e. medieval, many of those illustrations are donkeys and mule-type looking animals, and it seems it's a bit later on in the 16 and 1700s, there seem to be more ponies in illustrations. Obviously, this might not be an accurate portrayal because, you know, very few illustrations of pack animals have survived, but it's perhaps a bit telling that in the early images, it's donkeys predominantly that are being shown, even in this country. As to stubbornness, well, again, I think it depends who you talk to. Some people say that the mules work much harder than the horses, although they can be stubborn and really difficult to handle. But I've heard somebody say that they don't give up as easily as a pony or a horse might. I have no working knowledge. I've never worked with a mule or, in fact, a donkey. So I've only worked with ponies. I mean, this particular pony, who is a Dales pony, he was 14 years old when he climbed up to the top of the pike, and we did a whole month. We did 400 miles in 1 month. Around the Lake District Mountains, and we went over some precipitous passes, some really difficult ground, and I was very nervous to begin with because I wasn't sure that he would follow me, but I think he reckoned that if it was all right for me, because he was behind me, of course, in all of these steep climbs, if it was all right for me, then he would follow. And although I was told, oh no, he won't go to the top of the pike, I have the pictures to prove it indeed. So yes, that's my limited experience anyway.
Yes, perhaps he thought if it was safe for two legs, 4 legs were twice as safe.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have any other questions for Janet? Oh,
just a comment that I was interested in you talking about cadgers. The Canongate is a district in Edinburgh, and there's a Scottish country dance called Cadgers in the Canongate.
Oh.
It's just a comment,
Yeah.
yeah. Thank you. If there's no further questions, then I'll turn to Bob for the vote of thanks.
Thank you so much, Janet. You've clearly retained your skills as a teacher and steered us with clarity through the history, the technology, and the adventure of pack horses. And I feel that we've been on a journey with you tonight. When I'm on the motorway, I like to count Eddie Stobart lorries. I wondered if anybody in medieval times counted pack horses. But it's been lovely to share this experience with you. Thank you so much. Let's give Janet a big clap.
Thank you.